Good evening, everyone. I am Dolores Donnelly, Community Development Officer within Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council. I've organised this lecture series on behalf of Council, and this project has been fortunately part financed by the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. Welcome to week 2 of our lecture series, which has proven a great success so far. I would like to say that our recording will be on YouTube by early next week. And just that the guest speakers tonight will be Dr. Gerard MacAtasney, who will speak on the workhouse, creation of the workhouse system during the famine, with case study on Lurgan Workhouse, County Armagh. Gerard's books include The Dead Buried by the Dying, The Great Famine in Leitrim. Another is The Other Famine, 1982 Crisis in County Leitrim. And also another piece of work was his book on Leitrim and the Croppies. He's also contributed to the Atlas of the Great Famine and was co-author of The Hidden Famine, Poverty, Hunger and Sectarianism in Belfast. Gerard, would you like to start, please?
Thank you very much, Dolores. Last week we listened to Dr. Anya Dorn speaking about the 1833-1836 Poor Commission inquiry as a preamble to sort of studying the famine. And tonight, I want to look at what was in place prior to the building of the workhouses. And the workhouses, for many people, are seen as the epitome of the Great Hunger. Dark, foreboding, huge places, hated by the people who had to go into them, and still standing in many cases to this day. Camouflaged to a large extent by new buildings, for example, Lurgan and Lisburn. But if you look closely, you can still see that they are essentially the same buildings as were constructed in the late 1830s, early 1840s. So prior to the poor law being established in Ireland in 1838, there existed a system of parochial poor relief. This was designed around the local Church of Ireland through their cess and through their tithes. And they catered for the local poor, and it varied from place to place. There was no standardization. So in some places there would have been a census taken of the number of the poor, so they could work out how much was required. In other places it was done on an ad hoc basis. This developed throughout the 19th century, and you find then that in some other areas the poor were badged to stop outsiders coming through. And this was one of the great fears, that with the increasing population, more and more, especially if an area was quite generous or seen as being generous, more and more poor would arrive from different areas looking to avail of the relief that was there. And having studied this, I actually wrote a paper for Shannas Ardwaha around about 2008, I think it was, on basically how the poor were catered for in County Armagh. And it was entitled Mendicity and Charity in pre-famine County Armagh, but somebody's spell check went wrong, so it's actually in the book, or in the Shannas, under the title of Mendacity and Poverty in County Armagh. So if you want to read about lies in County Armagh pre-famine, that's the article about. But throughout that period, the population is increasing dramatically. The number of poor is increasing, and the Whately Commission, as it was called, from 1833 to 1836, estimated that about 2.8 million people were in severe distress for about 30 weeks of the year. So more than a third of the population in severe distress, in a land that was rich in so many ways in terms of natural resources. And of course, that's a question that has to be answered as well. Why did that happen? But one of the aspects that I found fascinating was the provision for the foundlings. Foundlings were children who were abandoned. And actually, if you look at what are called the outrage papers, say 1820s, 1830s, pre-famine, you find a significant number of cases of infanticide where children were killed by their parents, either due to the fact that they were born out of wedlock, or the family was just too poor and couldn't afford another child, so they were found in rivers, lakes, etc., down wells. But the foundlings then were catered for by the Church of Ireland with a cess. There was a tax that was passed over the parish. In the late 18th century, the Dublin Foundling Hospital was established, and this round about, it was the 1790s. And what you find then, looking through the vestry minutes from parishes throughout Ireland, is that the Church of Ireland are now sent foundlings to the Foundling Hospital. Thousands ended up there. They actually had a device whereby, for anonymity, a mother could, and it was always the mother who was left to cope with the child. The mother would put the baby into on the outside, on the door, in a basket outside, and the door would then revolve, and the child would end up in the foundling hospital, and the mother could just have lost the child. In fact, the foundling hospital was established in England in the 1740s. And to this day, you can still see the tokens that were left with the children by the mothers, with their initials carved in, the date they were left in, etc. They were in huge glass cases, very hard to look at because the mothers never saw their children again. The death rate in the Foundling Hospital in Dublin was in and around 90%. And I remember looking at that, the double, triple check that, but it was actually 90%. They were also, children were sent out to the country to nurse. So it was a last resort for the parishes to send them to there. But what you found then, that pre-famine, the population increasing dramatically, you had voluntary relief through the vestries. You also had initiatives in different towns. So, for example, in Newry, you had what was called the Newry Workhouse and Mendicity, which was a small workhouse which catered for people who had nowhere to live, and also then provided work for the people during the day and food. And crucially, they got food outside the workhouse and also at their homes. And these were two provisions which were banned under the Poor Law Act, which was established in 1838. And in Lurgan was quite a strange town compared to others. There was George Greer talked about it being a philanthropic society, was the distributed food to the poor. But Lurgan didn't have anything like Newry, and even in such a thriving industrial town, Newry had two newspapers: Newry Telegraph, Newry Examiner. Armagh had the Ulster Gazette. Lurgan had no newspaper until 1849, only lasted a year or so, and then it was only until the 1870s that there was a regular newspaper in Lurgan. So Lurgan sort of stands out as slightly different. Can't put my finger on why. And we mentioned Lurgan obviously because the Lurgan Workhouse is the case study. So the workhouses then are established in under the Poor Law Act of 1838, and this was very much a case of an English law being imposed on Ireland. Now, there were arguments for and against the Poor Law. Those who contributed in a charitable aspect, they supported the Poor Law because they said, right now, people are going to have to pay the tax which comes with the Poor Law, and it was a tax on the land to support the poor. Others objected to it, and they did find then that initiatives like the Newry Workhouse Mendicity declined. The Belfast Charitable Society, which celebrates its 250th anniversary in a couple of years, they were morbid about the whole idea of a poor law because they thought they would lose their institution. And one of the things that stands out with the poor law, one of the main objections to it, was, apart from the fact that it was antithetical to the Irish nature, was this idea of external interference. And you find this all the time, that those who ran the workhouses despised being told by the central commissioners what to do. So they're established in 1838 under the Poor Law, and they start emerging in the country 1840, 1841. By the time of the Great Hunger, 1845, one of the last ones opens, that's Glenties in County Donegal. There are 130 Poor Law workhouses in Ireland, and the Poor Law Union was the basis for the population for each workhouse. So it was roughly, the workhouse would have been centred in an area that had a 10-mile radius. So Lurgan, for example, included as far west in County Armagh as Tartarahan, over into northwest Down, Mara, and then up into southwest Antrim, up as far as Ballinderry. So it was 10 miles there. The further west you went, the larger the area got. So, for example, in Ballina, the area could be 25, 30 miles in circumference. And people then had to travel that distance if they wanted to seek relief. And there are tales of one woman who walked 25 miles in the snow in the winter of 1847 to seek relief for herself and her child, and she was deemed to be ineligible and had to walk back the 25. Whether she made it or not is another question. So there is a prelude to the foreboding workhouses being established in 1841, and that was the parochial poor law. That then declined, poor relief, that declined, and then you've got the workhouses coming to being from roughly 1841 onwards. Who did they cater for? Well, and what was the attitude of the administrators of the Poor Law? Well, George Nichols, who had established the workhouses in England under the 1834 Poor Law Act, he then became the Commissioner for Ireland. And he said, "I wish to see the poor house looked to with dread by our labouring classes. and the reproach for being an inmate of it extend downwards from father to son. Let the poor see and feel that their parish, although it will not allow them to perish through absolute want, is yet the hardest taskmaster, the closest paymaster, and the most harsh and unkind friend they can apply to. So not a place that you're going to enter lightly. And given, the construction of them, huge buildings, the Lurgan one was designed to hold 800. It was usually workhouses were designed to hold between 400 and 1,000. So Cork would have been 1,000, Belfast 1,000, Dublin North, South 1,000 each. The major cities would have had larger workhouses. And the poor commissioners commented as follows about the style of the building. The style of buildings is intended the cheapest description compatible with durability and simplicity of arrangement. All mere decoration being studiously excluded. So 22nd of February 1841, Lurgan Workhouse opened, and it receives its first inmates, 43 in total. And this is just a collection, a snapshot of those who were applying. This is typical. Sarah McCorry, 34, spinner, widow, Catholic, Lurgan town, admitted with one child, both in fever, came to workhouse in a cart, dirty, filthy, ragged, and miserable. John Lavery, 73, labourer, badly in fever, poor and naked. Had a wife and 5 children outside, but they were very poor and not able to keep them. Sarah Arnold, 84, widow, Catholic, Warrenstown, infection of lungs, wretched and filthy look, came in a cart. William, Mary, and Elizabeth Dines, 10, 7, and 5 respectively, Protestant, motherless and deserted by father, starved and nearly naked. William King, 60, flax dresser, Protestant, Lurgan town, rheumatic, came in a wheelbarrow, very wretched and dirty. So that is typical of what was entering the workhouse at that time. The most unfortunate, the old, the infirm, orphans, deserted children, mothers with young children. Bolstering the findings of the Poor Inquiry of 1836, there existed a body of people living in extreme poverty and destitution in this area. And then thirdly, a clue to the extent of reliance on the linen industry is given by the bulk of the population, referenced as to spinners and flax dressers. Out of a total of 652 entrants to the workhouse in 1844, 172, or over 1/4, were listed as making their living from one branch or other of the linen industry. Allowing for the old and infirm, this would appear to support the idea that even with a strong linen base, many within this industry were surviving at this lowest subsistence level prior to the famine. I dealt with that last week, where I talked about the deindustrialization, especially in the west of Armagh, where the land had been subdivided to a great extent, so that quarter-acre plots were standard because people had the weaving to rely on. Once that collapsed in the 1830s with the mechanization of spinning, then they faced as many problems as those in counties like Galway and Mayo. Now, throughout the years 1841 to 5, the workhouse served its purpose, catering for the destitute without any great difficulty, and numbers never rose above 55% of the capacity of the building. And having looked at most of the workhouses in Ulster as well, we find that this to be the case. You might get the odd fever outbreak, as we'll see here, but generally, the poor did not want to go to the workhouse. For some, maybe it was a way of seeing off an old relative, getting them into the workhouse, getting them away because they were too difficult to look after. And in fact, when you look at the workhouse, it's the early stages of the hospitals, obviously, and also dispensaries, which would have been the early stages of the GP service. They emerged from about 1812 onwards. So that by 1821-22, you have a fairly a good provision for dispensaries throughout Ulster. And then the workhouses are supposed to supplement this. But very rarely did they get about anywhere near their capacity. For example, 1842, the first full year in Lurgan, the average in the workhouse was 297. It was built to accommodate 800. Following year, 1843 is 258, 1844, 295, and 1845 then 222. However, in that year, May 1845, the first break in the previously sound administration occurred when, after allegations of poor management and levity of conduct were made against the master and matron, both resigned their position. The following month saw the appointment of 2 workhouse masters, Archibald Temple, who resigned after 4 months, and Charles Rooney, who started on the 22nd of October 45 and only stayed until the 4th of April 46. Such changes can hardly prove conducive to effective management, and indeed the first evidence of inefficiency and carelessness was manifested in the doctor's report of October 45, when he suggested that diarrhea and other connected problems among the young children were as a direct consequence of them being forced to sit in the nursery and schoolroom in cold and dank conditions. Further to this, in February 1846, a visiting committee from the Poor Law Commissioners described the house as being, quote, in a very filthy and unclean state. And the Guardians actually, I forgot to mention this, but the Guardians were, ostensibly there was an election of Guardians to run the Poor Law Union, usually in and around 30 men. Obviously, it was men all the time, no women played a leading role at this stage. And apart from some areas where it was politicized, and it was the first time, and it's always worth bearing in mind when we look at this period, the 1840s, that it's only less than 20 years prior, Catholic emancipation, 1829. So the first Catholic churches are only being built in many areas post 1829. So the Guardians then, they were elected in some areas, but mostly there was no election took place. And you would have found there would be competition between local landlords to get their agent a top place amongst the Guardians, because then they could influence the way the Poor Law was managed throughout the Union. And that was what was called by a Poor Law Union. So the street in Lurgan, where the workhouse was, the hospital now is, it's called Union Street. Nothing to do with the active union, but actually it was the Poor Law Union workhouse. So in 1846, the visiting committee said it was in a very filthy and unclean state. And the Guardians ordered the house to be cleansed and washed every day, with any pauper who refused to work forfeiting breakfast. Pauper was the term that was used to describe an inmate. And there's terminology of the time. So, for example, one of the wards was described as an idiot ward, and that was for people who were had mental health problems, as we say today, and also epileptics, but they were just described as idiots. Now, the first failure of the potato crop in August, and I mentioned this last week, August 45 had a limited impact on the Lurgan. There's hardly any increase in the workhouse number. About a third, 25% of the crop failed. And the major consequence of that is the increase in prices. April 45 from 1 shilling 11 pence per hundredweight to March 46, 3 shillings 3 pence per hundredweight. Now, of course, in every situation, somebody's going to try to capitalize. Thomas Bullock, and a supplier of potatoes, attempted to exploit the situation by demanding 4 shillings a hundredweight. However, the Guardians rejected this, and they had to settle for 3 and 6. And just burned the previous year, there'd been 1 and 11. The natural corollary of these price rises was the gradual reduction of potatoes in the workhouse diet, being replaced at first by bread and then by meal. And when we talk about people who benefited from the famine, we talk about those who provided the workhouses, whether it be with clothing, with straw for the various houses that required, with bedding, and really with meal. And sometimes you find some of the work I've done, for example, in Manor Hamilton workhouse in North Leitrim, that the Board of Guardians were given the contracts for meal to relatives. And nepotism, some things never change. And this is fairly, it's by no means uncommon, should say, at this period in various Poor Law unions. In April 46, dinner consisted of 7 ounces of meal made into stirabout. Stirabout was porridge. Meal was convenient because it was a cheap substitute, and in June, the Guardian circulated for tenders for supplies of the cheapest form available, yellow Indian meal. This, in spite of the fact that the Guardians, declared themselves averse to an exclusively oatmeal diet. There was a serious problem with Indian meal. Indian meal was rock hard, and it had to be boiled and boiled for hours and hours and hours before it became edible. And what you find that as the hunger moved on through 45, 46, and 47, people were so hungry, and as soon as they got the Indian meal, they ate it raw, and it killed them because it just destroyed their internal organs. The shortage of potatoes was also evident in the general union area. In Portadown, Board of Guardians objected to the workhouse being in Lurgan. It was all competition between Portadown and Lurgan, and it was heightened by the fact that the leading Guardian of Portadown was William Blacker, a leading Orangeman who had fought at the Battle of Ballinammuck in 1798. He led the Seagull Yeomanry there. And he was opposed by Charles Brownlow's agent, John Hancock. John Hancock had married the daughter of one of the leaders of the 1798 Rising. He was a Quaker and very much anti-Orange Order and a liberal. So you can see that there'd been a clash there for a number of reasons. Portadown, Montepedy Society, Montepedy, had been established in 1838 as a loan fund in direct opposition to pawnbroker shop. However, it occasionally made money available for local charitable purposes, and in May 46 gave a grant of £50 towards the purchase of Indian meal for the poor of the area. So proof indeed that the crop failure 45, as the year goes on and we're moving towards what was hoped to be a successful crop of 46, it's having an impact. However, the poor were turning in greater numbers to the workhouse. And by June 46, there were almost 450 inmates in it, with a quarter of these being in the fever hospital. Now, given that in 1845 there were 222, with more than twice the number by June 46. This high proportion warranted a visit from Dr. Stevens, warranted a visit from Dr. Stevens, the fever commissioners. They're always looking in the poor law commissioners, the fever commissioners, the Board of Health, all based in Dublin, and they're always keeping an eye on every workhouse. There's a huge amount of correspondence between the various groups there and the clerk of the union. And I always remember that this external interference is despised. Now it has consequences. In his report, Stevens recommended that additional accommodation would be necessary in order to cope with increased numbers of fever patients. That's despite the fact that there was room for 800 in the workhouse. He's saying we need a larger workhouse fever hospital. However, the Guardians rejected this recommendation and stated that Dr. Bell turned out a great number of convalescents within these few days, and consequently has much more room than when Dr. Stevens was here. So Bell, the medical officer for the workhouse, his solution to the problem, too many fever patients being in the workhouse, was to kick them out. Stevens also reported that fever was much more widespread than it should have been because Dr. Bell was allowing non-infected children to enter the fever hospital with their sick parents. In light of this, the commissioners concluded, Dr. Bell is unfit for his present office, and we have therefore called an order to be prepared for his removal, which we shall issue without delay unless he tenders his resignation. This appeared to be a reasonable demand given Bell's apparent negligence. However, the Guardians received it with concern and surprise, and in offering a vigorous defence of the medical officer, they pronounced confidence in his skill, humanity, and great kindness apart. They don't want to mention the word ability, of course. In fact, they went so far as to blame the commissioners themselves for any problems which had arisen. The buildings, which had proved inadequate, had been constructed under guidelines set out by them, whilst they had refused to supply paid nurses when the doctor had asked. Probably taken aback somewhat, the commissioners acquiesced, and on reviewing the evidence, exonerated Dr. Bell from 2 of 4 charges made against him. The Guardians were delighted with the outcome, and shortly afterwards, they unanimously resolved to increase Bell's salary by £20 per annum. That would have to have been cleared by the Poor Law Commissioners. So this was really, telling the Poor Law Commissioners, keep your nose out. And not only are we backing them, but actually we're going to give them an increase. And a £20 increase was a hell of an increase at this stage. So they had successfully thwarted the attempt by the Poor Law Commissioners to exert their influence. But Bell had still been accused of turning out, and found guilty, according to the commissioners, of turning out convalescent patients and allowing children to enter with their infected parents. And this had severe consequences in the months that followed. And it's actually worth noticing that, or worth mentioning actually, that even things like sometimes the Board of Guardians would, at Easter, in some poor law unions, or at Christmas, they would allow the paupers, the inmates, a small piece of meat for an Easter or a Christmas dinner. We're not talking about T-bone steaks here. A tiny piece of meat to supplement their normal diet. And then within a week or so, there would have been a letter in from the Poor Law Commissioners, having read the Board of Guardians minutes, saying, you can stop that. That's not allowed. It's not within the Poor Law. Don't do it again. So you can see here why the Lurgan Board of Guardians were delighted, as they would have seen it to have got one over on the Poor Law Commission. Moving on to 1846, the crop is decimated, and the most notable manifestation of this is the increase in number. And this happens throughout Ireland. I've looked at Ulster, and it's every poor law union is the same. Whether it's ultra rich unions in the likes of the east of the province, like Newton Ards, or up in North Antrim and Ballymoney, Larne, Antrim, they all face the same problem. At the end of September 46, the number was 313. By October, 432. By November, 598. And by the end of December, the workhouse was full to capacity with 805 inmates. This increase in admission rates was accompanied by a corresponding rise in the number of deaths. Throughout the year, the average would have been about 14. But in November, 31 paupers died, and in December, there were 58 deaths. And then this continued, it accelerated in January 47. The first week of January, there were 18. Now, we're talking about weeks here, not months. The first week of January, there were 18 deaths. Second week, 36. Following week, 55. The pages of the visiting chaplains' notebooks, Church of Ireland, Catholic and Presbyterian, previously occupied with details of divine services and scripture readings, now told a sorry tale of multiple burials, with both the Catholic and Episcopalian chaplains performing interments on a daily basis. Concern was expressed by the commissioners in Dublin, and on 16th January they sent a letter to the Guardians indicating their regret at what they termed the great mortality in the workhouse and requiring a detailed report from Dr. Bell on the reasons for the high number of deaths. Perhaps mindful of the report of Dr. Stevens in May 46, they also asked for a report on the sanitary conditions in the building. And again, have a look at the workhouses, most of the workhouses in Ulster. This stands out. And when I started this work, it was just part of a master's degree. And what I wanted to do, it was around about the sesquicentenary of the Great Hunger. And I wanted to just look at the impact in my local area. And I remember being told actually by an academic that, I think it was when I was doing my DPhil, one of the questions was, why did you study County Armagh? And I said, well, it's my local area, and I wanted to assess, the impact of this historic event. And they said, that's not enough. You need to have a historic reason, almost like a historical scientific reason to study a particular area. I disagree with this. I think that, if you live in an area and you want to see the impact, then it's warranted to study it in detail using all the sources. In fact, one of the best pieces of work I've read on this would be by Charlie Dillon. I think the study was published in Shanna's Armagh as well. And Charlie's from the Moy area, which is on the Armagh Throne border. And he does a really in-depth, detailed analysis of the impact of the famine in that area. Why? Because he's from that area and he wanted to see what had happened. So here we have then, the commissioners are startled. It's not happening. Maybe in a Enniskillen workhouse is the only other one in the province where there's issues. So Bell, in his reply, states that many deaths had occurred because numerous people had entered the workhouse in a sick condition and had died shortly afterwards. Thus, mortality in the workhouse is much greater than under ordinary circumstances, and it is a well-known fact that many dying persons are sent for admission merely that coffins may be thereby obtained for them at the expense of the union. In relation to sanitation, he reported that as there were 4 times the usual number of inmates, the building was now overcrowded, and consequently it had been impossible to provide dry bedding. Hence, sleeping upon damp beds has increased fever and bowel complaints, which have in many cases proved fatal. However, the doctor concluded his report with optimism by arguing that the cause of such deaths would be largely eradicated with the purchase of new bedding and the creation of a proper drying house. Such a statement, whether to placate the commissioners or not, was soon shown to be rather utopian, as in subsequent weeks, mortality levels, far from falling, actually increased. In the weekend, the 23rd of January, 58 died. 30th of January, 68 deaths. 6th of February, 95 deaths. 13th of February, 67 deaths. And this may then be thought to be representative of what was happening throughout Ulster, but actually it wasn't. The weekend, the 6th of February, there were 95 deaths. This represented slightly less than 1/5 of the province's total mortality for that week, which was 529. Second highest was 30 deaths in Enniskillen. Nationally, the highest number was in Cork, where with a workhouse population of 5,500, which is 6 times that was in Lurgan, 128 deaths have occurred. In the province of Connaught, the highest level was in Loughrea Workhouse, County Galway, where with 524 inmates, 26 had died. The following week's total of 67 was second in Ulster behind that of Glenties, County Donegal, where 69 out of 426 had died. Once again, Cork was the highest with 164 deaths. Worth noting that Glenties was later to be deemed as one of the distressed districts by the British Relief Association, the only one in Ulster. As such, large-scale relief was required to stave off widespread poverty and hunger. At the same time, Cork has become synonymous with the horrors of famine and the existence of mass famine graves in Skull, Skibbereen. So in the months of 1847, the Lurgan area, described by a local paper as a prosperous and thriving town, was suffering a level of workhouse mortality on a par with the worst affected areas in the country. Dr. Bell's explanation that many deaths had occurred from sleeping on wet beds does not appear to have been entirely satisfactory, as members of staff, presumably enjoying better accommodation than the paupers, began to fall ill. By late January, the porter had dysentery, and the assistant wardmaster, together with the schoolmaster, were ill in fever. In February, the assistant wardmaster died, and the clerk was suffering from the high symptoms of dysentery. And it's worth pointing out that the majority of deaths throughout the country in this period weren't from starvation. Yes, there were cases of starvation, there's no two ways about it, but it was illnesses consequent upon stomach-related problems. So it was dysentery, it was chronic diarrhea, and of course fever as well, relapsing fever. So these were the main killers. And if you look at any of the statistics from the Prudhoe Commissioners from the 1846 onwards, you see that it's fever, it's dysentery, it's chronic diarrhea, and then there are cases of marasmus, of starvation, etc. But the vast majority were people were eating anything, and a lot of the food wasn't what they were used to eating, and the likes of the Indian cornmeal, they just couldn't deal with it, they didn't know how to cook it until well into maybe 1847. In a desperate attempt to alleviate what the Guardians called this dreadful visitation, two remedies were attempted. First, all available space was to be utilised in order to avoid overcrowding. Thus, the aged and infirm women were moved to a room above the stairs, and the women's day room was required for hospital purposes. And this is standard. Every workhouse in Ulster had extensions, temporary or permanent, and also in some cases huge tents were erected. Belfast, the workhouses where the city hospital is now in the Lisburn Road, and in Lurgan, opposite where the hospital is now, there were huge tents erected to deal with overcrowding. However, the Guardians felt that more drastic action was required. On the 5th of February, they issued the following announcement. Notice is hereby given that in consequence of the present state of the workhouse and fever hospital, the Guardians have been obliged to close their doors for the present against all further admissions. As a consequence, admissions were restricted to a trickle throughout this period from February to April, with authorities only allowing large numbers of applicants back in May. And that's what I was referring to last week when the system collapsed. The administration couldn't deal with it. When you had the workhouse master, the matron, various ward masters, the clerks, all being seriously ill or dying, then you find that the standard books that were used to run the place, whether it be the admission registers or the Body Guardian minutes or whatever, they weren't filled in. So we don't have a precise figure, for example, of deaths in this period, certainly in workhouses, because they weren't recorded. The numbers weren't allowed in. So this puts huge pressure then on the outside resources, the relief committees established throughout the country. As a second measure taken by the board was to request a visit by 3 eminent physicians in order to remedy the unprecedented extension of disease and death. The doctors, Thompson, Cumming and Purdon, recommended that a third medical officer, along with Doctors Bale and McVeigh, was essential to meet the current epidemic. They also conveyed the opinion that the present pauper's diet was inadequate, in that recently they had been receiving soup for dinner and 4 ounces of rice for supper instead of bread and buttermilk. The doctors considered such a diet to be insufficient to meet demand of paupers and recommended the following regime. So this was, again, diets were always being changed, whether it was to save money or in this case, to try to improve the health of the paupers. Breakfast, 3.5 ounces of meal and porridge, 1/4 pint of buttermilk. Dinner, 6 ounces of bread, 1 pint of broth. Supper, 3 ounces of bread, 1/4 pint of buttermilk. They also stipulated that the porridge was to be made entirely of oatmeal, not Indian meal. The closure of the workhouse and visit of the doctor suggests the authorities and medical staff were having severe problems coping with the numbers of destitute persons now prevalent in the Lurgan Union. Indeed, in a communication to the Relief Commissioner's office in Dublin, John Hancock, one of the Guardians I mentioned, reported that of 313 cases on the books of the Lurgan dispensaries, this is very local, 136 were suffering from fever and dysentery. For the same period in 1846, that total had been 20. The extent of the epidemic may be gauged by Hancock's inquiry as to whether the Central Board of Health could appoint a medical officer to provide food and medicines for diseased, destitute people at their own houses. This was because the workhouse had been closed and he realised people needed help. But of course, this was turned down because you could not supply food or medicine to people in their houses, certainly not at this stage. Unfortunately, no reply to this letter exists, but it illustrates the extent to which fever and its associated ailments had become endemic in the Lurgan area and the level of helplessness felt by concerned gentlemen like Hancock. However, any belief that disease was rampant could not be blamed on the authorities, was challenged by 2 devastating and condemnatory investigations, one from within the workhouse, the other from without, which cast huge doubts over the incompetence of both the medical and administrative staff of that institution. And as at this stage, you look back to the report of June 1846, the upshot of which was the demand to dismiss the medical officer, which was turned down. The Newry Telegraph got wind of what was happening and talked about the frightful mortality in the workhouse, the fact that many of the office holders as well as the paupers had been ill or were presently ill. The Belfast Vindicator, meanwhile, informed its readers that nearly 400 paupers had died in the Lurgan Workhouse during the last 8 weeks. Commissioners had also been monitoring the situation, and obviously dissatisfied with the previous report of Dr. Bale, they decided to send Dr. Smith from the Central Board of Health to investigate workhouse conditions. Now, Smith visited 2 other workhouses in Ireland, Bantry and Cork, 300 miles to the south. He couldn't get much further south than Bantry. And in the winter of 1847, he then travelled north to Lurgan to investigate what was happening. So you can just imagine, you can just realise how bad the situation was that this man was asked to travel that far in those conditions to ascertain what was going on in the Lurgan Workhouse. So he completed his report on the 17th of February. And this concentrated on the standard of medical care in the workhouse, but as a consequence, it offered an insight into the competence of the general administration therein. The most striking feature of the institution that emerged was the level of overcrowding. Smith reported that in the male and female infirmaries, there was an average of 2 persons to each bed, although 3 and 4 per bed was not uncommon. And remember that these were people with fever. The wards themselves were found to be in a terrible condition. Quote, there are 4 wards in the idiot department that are without any flooring but the earth, and in 2 of them there are no bedsteads, so that the beds lie upon the wet ground. One of them, in which at the time of my visit 2 wretched creatures were dying, was in an exceedingly foul condition. In one corner a pile of old filthy clothes, shoes, etc. In another a large heap of straw. In another place a quantity of coal scattered about. The ventilation was very imperfect. Further investigation found the floors and the walls of the infirmary to be in a very discreditable condition, with the windows almost universally closed, the atmosphere close, the smell upon entering the rooms most offensive. Walls had not been whitewashed, buckets used as lavatories were allowed to sit for hours without being emptied, and medicines and drinks were served out on the floor where the boards were in a filthy state. A similar scenario was presented to the doctor in the fever wards. However, the fever hospital, controlled by a full-time nurse, was found to contain comfortable beds, clean walls and floors, well-ventilated wards, and well-attended patients. Due to general overcrowding, it emerged that, as a result of an inadequate supply of garments, the clothes of those paupers who had died of fever or dysentery was immediately used by other paupers without prior cleaning and drying. So paupers died, and the new intake received their clothes. Another area of concern was that of pauper burials. Evidently, many paupers had been buried less than 4 yards from the fever hospital, and in the centre of the burial ground was the well which supplied water to the workhouse. In fact, the graves had been dug so close to it that the water had become muddy and unfit for use. Not surprisingly, in the light of what had been witnessed, Smith described the Lurgan Workhouse as a picture of neglect and discomfort such as I have never seen in any other charitable institution. And I think that says a lot when people ask, was it typical? What was it like in the rest of Ulster? Well, here's a man coming from 2 workhouses in Cork describing it thus. He recommended the following measures be implemented as soon as possible. All admissions to the workhouse to cease until fever and dysentery cases abate, that already put in place. All rooms used by the sick to be properly fumigated and whitewashed. Movement of some patients from the infirmary to the workhouse where space was available. Thorough whitewashing of the infirmary, cleansing of its floors, improvement of its ventilation. And finally, daily inspection of the above recommendations be carried out by the medical officer. He specifically mentioned that. Excuse me. Alongside such improvements, Smith felt it necessary to apportion blame for the terrible conditions which he had encountered, and remarked, it's not difficult to deduce the causes of the mortality which has lately devastated the Lurgan Workhouse, and which still continues. He believed that the problem stemmed from the death of the master, John Mason, in early November 46, and the fact that 3 weeks passed before a successor was appointed. During this period, overcrowding had developed and continued till the end of January. This, coupled with the fact that many subordinate officers had been ill at one time or another, meant that ventilation, whitewashing, cleanliness appeared to have been neglected at the very time when the strictest attention to these important means of arresting the spread of disease were most imperatively called for. He contended that, despite a heavy workload, a little more activity on the part of Dr. Bell, together with a stricter surveillance by the guardians, would have prevented much of the mortality, stating, it appeared to me that the guardians had no knowledge of the state of the infirmary as regards cleanliness, ventilation, etc., either from personal observation or otherwise. The reports of the physicians informed them of its overcrowded state, and this was the only particular about it with which they seemed to have been acquainted. He concluded his report with the following indictment of the workhouse administration. I am of the opinion that the chief causes of the evil in question are internal and the result of defective management of the situation. In effect, follow on from the previous report. of June 1846. Only this time, hundreds of people had died as a consequence. Another report then emerged from outside. One of the chaplains, the Reverend Olton, Church of Ireland chaplain for Lurgan, and he says he felt the need to draw his attention to the appalling standard of food being served in the workhouse. It is hardly to be wondered at that so much disease should be in the workhouse if the description of food has for any length of time been such as I saw there today. He said that the bread used for supper was dark coloured, insufficiently baked and sour, whilst the broth was so bad that many paupers could not use it. He described the meat as being of the worst description that could be got in Lurgan Street, more like the flesh of an animal that had died of disease than being killed for food. Further, he doubted whether the cooking utensils and kitchen were in a hygienic condition. It was once in a very bad state and might be so again. Olton concluded his letter thus: I could not refrain from mentioning these matters to you, which doubtless have had no inconsiderable share in producing the dreadful mortality which has swept our workhouse, and I am sure you will take the earliest opportunity of investigating them to the utmost. So there was an internal inquiry convened by the Board of Guardians involving the principal workhouse officers. The ward master, Thomas Lutton, said that the bread had been bad for over a week and believed it to be unfit for human food. He continued, many of the sick paupers have complained to me that the bread was so bad they could not eat it, and I consider their complaints were well founded. He said the beef used for soup was of a very poor quality and reported this to Mr. Bullock. He said it had a very offensive smell, but this soup was afterwards sent to the patients in the hospital. However, the stark contrast between the lives of the paupers and those of the workhouse officers is illustrated by Lutton's following revelation. The bread furnished to the officers cannot be complained of and is much superior to what is provided for the pauper. This point was corroborated by another ward master, William Furley, who stated the baker, when he brings bread, always has the officer's bread in a basket by itself. Furley also said the pauper's bread was unfit for human consumption, a view shared by Dr. Bell, who believed the bread had been of a poor quality for almost 2 months. Bell further remarked that the meat had been defective for a long time, though never as bad as now, and concluded, I have no hesitation in stating that the disease in the house would not have been as bad if we had had a sufficient supply of wholesome bread and good beef, such as was contracted for. Dr. McVeigh concurred with this opinion, believing that the diarrhea and dysentery now prevalent had been aided by the use of substandard bread. From my experience as a medical man, I don't know a worse description of food for persons affected with diarrhea, dysentery, than sour bread. The immediate consequence of the inquiry was the return of £200 of bread to the contractor. However, John Hancock, in a letter to the commissioners, reported that only £6 of meat had been deemed to be unsound. He also offered a possible explanation for the obvious chaos in the workhouse as being the fact that the master and matron both had fever, and thus their duties were being undertaken by the schoolmaster and mistress, who were doing their duty as well as can be expected under the present trends and circumstances. Now, the upshot was that Dr. Bell was forced to resign, arguably a year after he should have done in the first place. He was obviously, the workhouse was overwhelmed by the huge numbers, unprecedented numbers, as was every other workhouse. But the Lurgan Workhouse had previous, to use that term, and the signs were there. They were ominous signs prior to what happened from November, December 1846. I read out last week an account of the burial. So for those who didn't hear this, this was in the Lurgan Workhouse grounds. In the graveyard attached to the house, a large grave is made which fills nearly full of water a short time after it is opened. To its verge are brought the coffins containing the dead bodies. These coffins frequently contain 2 and 3 each. They are then put into the grave, in which they usually float. 1 or 2 persons then stand on the coffins in the water until the mould is heaped upon them. There are frequently 20 bodies in the one grave. So here we have mass burials in Lurgan. Now, it's just been I'm digressing slightly here, my privilege to have finished writing a history of Clan Gael, Cumberland Class Gael on Lurgan. It was their centenary last year. And the thing that stood out for me as a researcher was going through hundreds and hundreds of newspaper reports of games, looking at reports of AGMs, reading letters to newspapers, etc.
Sorry, George. Sorry, yes. Apologies. Just for our audience, can you explain Clan Gael, who they are, just briefly? Because
sorry, Clan Gael, Cumberland Class Gael, GAA club in Lurgan. So camogie, Gaelic football for ladies and men. So it was their centenary. They were established in 1922. And the reason I mention that, I just spent I always keep thinking it's 4 years writing that book. And as a researcher, you always learn something when you're writing a book. And this one, what stands out for me is that amidst all the hundreds of newspaper reports that I mentioned, was the fact you were able to interview people who were involved, whether it be at the playing level, at the administrative level, or as supporters. And you're talking to people who are in their early 90s, most of them in their 70s and 80s, some in their early 90s, and their memories going back to the 1940s, and then remembering what their parents had told them maybe about the 1920s, 30s. And the point I'm making is that when you're looking at the newspaper reports, when you're looking at in that situation, when you're looking at something like the Great Hunger, thousands of documents, workhouse registers, letters to the poor law commissioners, letters to the Relief Committee in Dublin, the Relief Committees writing the Irish Relief Association papers, the Society of Friends, huge archive. When you're looking through the newspapers, you're scratching the surface. You're only scratching the surface. And I suppose the nearest thing we have to, I just read out an account of people being buried in the workhouse grounds. Who were they? And it's very easy to say, oh, during the famine, 1841, 1851, population of around about 8 million, 8.5 million, 1 million died and 1 million emigrated. It just flows off the top. And the reality is borne out in the poorhouse admission register. Here we have the names, occupation, religion, gender, the area that they came from. And there were 130 poor law unions I mentioned last week. There are only 17 unions for which these registers exist, and not in their entirety for all of them. 12 of these are in Ulster, 2 in Armagh, Lurgan and Armagh poor law unions. I'm going to read out now, and this is just purely random. This is 24 names of people who entered the Lurgan Workhouse in December, on the 17th of December, 1846. They all died. 22 out of the 24 entered the workhouse in a healthy state. So I'm just going to read them as follows. So it'll be the name, the age, occupation, religion, and also the area. Catherine Green, 40, and her son Robert, 3. She was a labourer, Protestant, from Tullylish. Margaret Quayle, 27, single, a labourer, healthy, from Derryad. Anne Morris, 17, single, a weaver, Protestant, from Kernan. Dennis Brown, 6, deserted, Protestant, union at large. Union at large meant that they couldn't find out where they were from, and particularly in the union, so it could have come from anywhere. He'd been deserted by his parents if they were still alive, or else they had died and he had nowhere else to go. Margaret Kennedy, 81, single, a spinner, Catholic, infirm, from Ballydugan. James Neal, 74, married, labourer, Catholic, from Ahagallen. Elizabeth Carson entered with her 5 children. She was 43. The children were Ellen, 14, and David, 12. They both survived until June and July 1847 and then left the workhouse. But Ellen, 43, she had been deserted by her husband. She was a Presbyterian from Tullylish, along with her children, Thomas, 10, Robert, 5, and Sarah, a year and a quarter. They all died in the workhouse. Eleanor Wright, 25, single, spinner, Protestant, healthy, from Bray, near Portadown. Anne Jane Wright, and 17 months old, that was Eleanor Wright, 25, and her child, Anne Jane, 17 months. They both died within days of each other in January 1847. Rose Corrigan, she was married. She was a weaver, a Catholic, union at large. She entered the workhouse. She was 45. She entered the workhouse with her daughter, Mary, 11, son, John, 18, and other son, Patrick, he was 20 months. They all died. Anne Best, she was 50. She was married, a winder, Protestant, from Kernan. She entered the workhouse with William, 9, Martha, 5, Elizabeth, 3. They all died. William Fox, 58, married, labourer, Catholic, from Kernan. Anne Jane Best, there was only one surviving member of the Best family. 5 of them died. The only survivor was Anne Jane. She was 12. She left the workhouse in August 1847. And lastly, Elizabeth McCann, 57, single, a sore, Protestant, from Carrabrack. That gives I think, a different perspective on when we're talking about the numbers that died, that here you had real people, names, the areas they came from, the conditions, where they, what they worked at, who their family were. And one of the things you find is, as you go through it, now that's 24. In the Lurgan Workhouse in 1847, and I've mentioned already about the workhouse registers not being fully filled out in February, March, April 47. There were at least 1,000, possibly 1,200 deaths in that 1 year in one workhouse. And that's just a fragment of those who died. So I think it puts real meat on the bones of those who died, to use a term, but also this idea that so many died. We're actually talking about real people here who lived their lives, who had their children, who were forced into an institution they never wanted to go. And actually, the chairman of the Mara, Workhouse Mara, just about 5 miles outside Lurgan, said, we refuse to send our poor to that house of mortality, as he referred to. So that's my talk for tonight. I hope it shed some light on an aspect of the Great Hunger in Ulster. And one of the things I take from this all the time is the fact that in Armagh and not too many other areas, we actually can dig into who these people were and put names to the otherwise anonymous numbers of thousands or a million. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Gerard, there's just a few questions we'll go through. What is the name of the commission overseeing the workhouses?
They were the Poor Law Commissioners. They were based in Dublin.
So the Poor Law Commissioners. So someone asked, can you spell it? Poor Law. P-O-O-R-L-A-W. Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor Law Commissioners. Okay. And are there records for the people entering the workhouses in Donegal? Would I know? You're actually in
Letterkenny. There's one. The best records are for County Antrim and North Antrim. There's 5. Armagh, there's 2. Mahara-Felt, Enniskillen, none for Belfast. There's nothing for Derry. There's nothing for Tyrone. But Letterkenny and Donegal, there's one.
So there are some records, and if you wanted to try and access those records, where would someone start looking?
Well, can I just say that, people might wonder where those records went to, and I remember talking to a man in Monaghan in the late 90s when I was looking at working on the Famine in Ulster then, and he said that he remembered as a child in the 1940s cycling behind these big carts which were being drawn to a dump, and he said on the carts were huge books with gold clasps that had been taken out of the workhouses, and they were being converted into hospitals, and they were all burnt. And yes, it's shocking from one perspective that we lost those records, but people were so ashamed that they didn't. I've come across people saying, if you ever do research in the family tree, I don't want to mention how anybody was in the poorhouse or the workhouse. You can access them. Public Record Office in Belfast, the Donegal County Library, and there's also stuff in the National Archives.
So we're talking about the National Archives in Dublin.
National Archives in Dublin, but the main one would be for the north would be the Public Records Office in Belfast. So
that's a public. I just want to mention slowly. I'm just conscious that some of our listeners. So the Public Records Office in Belfast, and then you mentioned also in Donegal. So that's Donegal. Did you say Donegal?
Letterkenny, yeah.
In Letterkenny, did you say Donegal County Council was or Donegal?
Yeah, that's the
Can you recall?
It would be the local library service in Letterkenny.
So the local library service in Letterkenny would be managed by Donegal County Council, if just anybody's inquiring about that. Another question is, you mentioned, sorry, just apologies, I think, what was the name of the book you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk, Gerard? Within, you mentioned there was an article about pre-famine life in Armagh. What was that?
Right. Well, that's a journal that's brought out every year, every 2 years in Armagh. The Shanahas Ard Waha. It's the Armagh Historical Journal. It's actually called Shanahas Ard Waha. S-E-R-N-C-H-I-S.
Sorry, can you slowly, please?
Yeah, S-E-R-N-C-H-I-S. The Shanahas, and then Ard, A-R-D, and then Waha, M-H-R-C-H-I.
I'll actually put that in an email later to everyone, just if anybody's interested.
It's Mendicity and Poverty in County Armagh.
Okay. And the Indian meal you mentioned, apologies, this is a question put in the comment. I'm not sure how to pronounce some of the words, but was Indian meal, would you know, was it treated with the likes of lime to help prevent any diseases?
All I know about the Indian meal that it was used because it was the cheapest food possible, but the poor didn't realize, the people who were going to eat it outside the workhouse, that it had to be boiled. It was rock hard.
Okay.
It had to be boiled over and over again before it became edible.
And probably because people were already suffering from malnutrition, so their bodies would have found it even harder to try and process and would have had a actually more severe impact on their systems. Yeah.
I just noticed there somebody said about the Dungannon.
Sorry, can you
Workhouse.
talk a little bit closer, sorry, to your screen, Gerard, and you're just suddenly going out of hearing?
No problem. No, I just noticed there about the Dungannon Workhouse register being online. There's actually a book of deaths from Dungannon, and each workhouse had a book of deaths. So that's available in the Public Records office in Belfast, the book of deaths for Dungannon. But the actual admission registers aren't. There aren't admission registers.
Just for anyone, Dungannon is a town in County Tyrone,
Yes,
in
sorry.
Ulster, just
Yeah,
for those of us.
yeah, right. Yeah.
You mentioned Clan the Gael Club. Was this mentioned as you retrieved interviews,
That was
etc. from?
basically all that was. No, all that was, it was a digression from a researcher's point of view. What that was to just make the point that, you know, when you're researching a modern subject where people are still alive, that you can actually interview those people and get a different perspective as opposed to maybe what appears in a newspaper or whatever, whether it be a political perspective or a sporting perspective. And I use both of those in this book that I've just finished. But what the point I was making, that the nearest we can get to the people who actually were there in the workhouse are these admission registers, and in case, you know, in terms of their who they were.
Yeah. Someone actually commented here that thanks for highlighting the human dimension, names and fragments of lives, which should not be forgotten. I just want to just add that we mentioned that some information will be available within the Public Records Office in Dublin. I suppose make people aware too that unfortunately a lot of records were lost during the Civil War. Would that be correct? So,
Well,
or were they of this kind?
Well, I don't want to contradict you there, but certainly, and the records pertaining to this period were lost willfully. If we're looking at workhouse records, because there was this stigma of being in the workhouse, which was referred to by everybody locally in every area as the poor house. So nobody wanted, you know, by the time the 1940s came around, people just had this idea, we want to forget about that. So they threw the books out. There's a great collection in the National Archives in Dublin, the Relief Commission papers, which have been used extensively for each county. And also there's an even better collection in my view, which is the Society of Friends Relief of Distress papers, which is just a vast collection of papers, which deals with a lot of information locally, but also looking at the imports of food and how it was organized from America. A huge amount of information on that. No, so there wouldn't have been an awful lot gone, and thankfully in the fire of 1922, the effect, I think all the information was seen.
Thank you. And in relation to accessing records on PRONI, PRONI is a Public Records Office in Northern Ireland based in Belfast. Can you view them online? You can certainly visit the offices and access records.
Yeah, you can get a very brief synopsis if you type in a reference number or whatever. You know, they all come under BG for Board of Guardians, so you can start off with that online. But in terms of doing the research, no, maybe in the future. But at this stage, no. So what they will have there is the Board of Guardian minutes, which are very dry administrative books, but there's really good information in them, obviously, statistical information, etc. As I say, there are 12 in Ulster that have the admission registers, and then you also get some chaplains notebooks, a lot of in and out letters, but it's very dry sort of stuff. But certainly if you're looking for people are interested in family history and all that, you just need to ascertain what areas have are available for admission registers and take it from there. It is a trawl through them. There's been no index made of it or anything like that.
Okay. Someone else mentions here that just a comment, starvation diet, some details in relation to, let's say, for example, vitamin C deficiency can equal then organ failure, failure to relation to absorption of iron, leading to weakness,
Oh
Feel
yeah,
your
very much so. I
like
mean,
blood, just a ride. It's a kind of it's a cycle of a tipping point.
well, very
Deficiency
much
in
so.
one thing leads to other medical problems.
Yeah, well, what you had
Um,
certainly within the workhouse, and this happened outside the workhouse, but within the workhouse, if you look at it, one of the things I've looked at as well is the debt incurred by workhouses. That arises from the fact, number one, that there were huge numbers entering, but also that the expense of each pub was increasing. So prior to the famine, say the weekly cost of a pub would have been 9 pence, by early 1847, it's maybe 1 shilling and 7 pence. Why? Because they require medication. So if you multiply that increase by 500 people who wouldn't have been there otherwise, then they're looking to cut costs. So they introduced the cheapest meal, which is, nutritionally the poorest, which is Indian cornmeal, but they're not particularly worried about that as the Lurgan Workhouse illustrated, because they just want to feed them for as cheap a rate as they possibly can. And you find this then as you move through into 1847-48, the British government declares the famine over in August 47 because there's a successful crop, which is nonsense, of course, because the crop was minuscule compared to what was needed, but allows them to introduce what was called the Poor Law Extension Act, which meant that all relief had to be within the workhouse, but they also then allowed for outdoor relief for the first time. So they realized, what was happening here. I suppose it happened in various crises throughout the world with different governments. They were making policy on the hoof. They started off with the relief committees, subbing them, as it were, from 46 onwards, and the public works. Then they realised by January 47 we need to be feeding the people, so they introduced the Temporary Relief Act, also known as the Soup Kitchen Act. In March 47, they fed up to 3 million people between then and August, and then they shut it down. And it's actually, when you look at the letters coming in from people throughout the country, they can't believe it's being shut down, because we should have had this months before. Now you're actually feeding the people, you're saving thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, keep it going, but they didn't. And they introduced the Temporary Relief Act, and that's where I keep making reference to the Society of Friends. Their papers show that they then provided huge amount of food and clothing throughout all counties right up until 1851, 1852. They provided grants, for example, in this local area to the fishermen of Loch Ness to build boats. Not grants, actually. I was going to say grants to fishermen. Their names would still be in the same areas to build boats so they could go pulling fishing in Loch Ness, because they realised that it wasn't a short-term fix, that it needed to be long-term. And after feeding the people, they then gave them clothes and then helped them establish model farms, various industries, etc. They did their best.
Thanks, Gerard. Just another comment is that there are some commissioner reports on a website, archive.org, for people for future reference. There's records of deaths on Dungannon Workhouse are also available. In relation, there's a website called dungannonworkhouse.com, and Clonus Library in County Monaghan has some records of some of the County Monaghan records.
Yes, and in fact, some of those have just been turned up in the last 2 years. If in terms of the workhouses in Carrickmacross, they've developed, they've basically revamped what was one of the wings of the workhouse, so you can do a tour of it. I did it a few years ago, and they focus on the orphan girls who went to Australia. So you can actually get a tour of the workhouse. There's also probably one of the best examples, untouched, of a workhouse. Certainly, the front building would be in Armagh, the primatial city of Armagh, where you've got the administrative block at the front, where it says the date above it, 1841. And then, and I've never seen this anywhere else, you've actually got where the people would have been laid out into, they were split up. So families were split up by gender and by age. So you have 4 distinct yards there with the walls still intact, and you've got the male, female for both girls, boys, men, and women. So I mean, that is worth a look. I don't think that's been highlighted. Actually, it's one of the best remaining examples of the workhouse administration built and the yards associated with it.
George, you mentioned a local historian called Charlie Dillon from the Moy
Yes.
in County Tyrone.
Yes.
Is that writings he has within, what's the organisation his work is based within?
He's involved with 2. He's involved with Comanchana Historic Waha, which would be the journal that I mentioned, the one that I had in. It also might be in an organisation called Dúcha Níl, which is the O'Neill Country Historical Society. It might actually be in that. But it'll be in one or other of those. But it's one of, sorry, go ahead.
And what was the name of it?
DU fada ICHE, Ducha, DU fada ICHE, and then Neil, NE fada ILL, Ducha Neil. It's the only country historical association or society based in around the Moy, Blackwater town, Benburb, that area.
Okay. And apologies everyone, I'm kind of quite close of time. Just someone has quickly asked, will we be looking at the 19th century census records? Unfortunately, won't be able to in this lecture series, but if the opportunity comes up to deliver organised further lectures in the future, it's certainly something I'll have on a list for us. I'm conscious everybody may want a rest break here, but just one final question. Any further plans to preserve what is left of Lurgan Workhouse? Unfortunately, I don't think this is a question we can answer. Have you any knowledge of that?
No, I remember being at an unveiling of a plaque there in the late, I think it was around about 1999 or 98, and I don't know what's happened to it. I know there were plans to maybe reinstate that or making it more prominent. But in Carrick and Shannon, County Leitrim, the old workhouse there, which was also notorious for various reasons, and I think David might touch on these in his talk, and I can maybe mention what happened in Carrick as well. But they've taken a part of the workhouse, made it into the museum, so you can actually visit and see where the unfortunate people would have been at the time of the famine. Those attics are still there in the Lurgan Workhouse. I've been in them. I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, but I visited those as well. So they're still there. So it's a case of obviously the hospitals, who they're owned by, etc. There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape, but it would be nice to see, something like that restored, so people could just get a feel of, and maybe some sort of a memorial, given that we are fairly unique in having only 12 in Ulster out of 130 in the country, having the admission registers. So you could have the lists of names of everybody who died, and I think that would be a fitting testament to their
And just one very final question. What were the conditions for people who were, when the workhouse was full, maybe especially those who would have been turned away? I think it's very hard to really estimate for see how.
This was met with, they were just absolutely aghast. The relief committees, once they were informed, and you can just imagine the workhouse is closed, because this is where people had to be investigated before they were allowed into the workhouse, their conditions and all that. And once they realised, right, we can't send our poor there anymore, so they're just going to come back on us. So the relief committees then were inundated, and that's why the British government was basically forced into establishing the Temporary Relief Act, where they fed people outside the workhouses, because they realised the workhouse system was never designed to deal with a catastrophe like the Great Hunger. And it'd be an interesting counterfactual exercise to look at, would the deaths have been to the same extent without the workhouses? So Irish society without the workhouses, on the basis of, say, parochial relief, which had been there prior to 1838, and also which was still extant in Scotland. So, the premise would be that the local people know they're poor, they know their needs, and they can look after them, rather than build a huge building where by cramming so many people in as you could, obviously then it was going to be widespread disease. So it'd be, interesting counterfactual exercise.
Thank you very much, Gerard.